Carthage must be destroyed. Hello everyone, we're in the next part of the Lion Rampant walkthrough and we're looking at the turn sequence. In every game there are sequences of turns and if you've played games before, obviously they're very important because you gotta know who's moving what and when, right? So Lion Rampant's very simple. Lion Rampant's turn sequence has basically an attacker's phase, and that's the people that are the attackers in whatever scenario you're doing, and then there's a defender's activation phase. So you have the attacker's activation phase, and then it goes to the defender's activation phase. The attackers basically fill out all of their orders, all of the things they need to do, and then it switches to the defender's activation phase, and then they fill out all of their orders and all their activations. If there's more than 2 players, if there's 3 and up players, those people will follow whatever order comes after the attacker and the defender. Now, depending how you play, we're not at that point yet, but scenarios will probably dictate who's the attacker and who's the defender. And if there's, if it's just a big battle between 3+ people, maybe you roll dice to see who's first, second, third. So basically, you have the order of the attackers are going first, and then the defenders go next. And and at the end of the turn, it's basically that turn is done and you start over with the attackers again. So very simple, very straightforward, a very basic, easy concept to grasp. So the order of activating your units, there are 4 basic things you have to do per your turn, or rather 4 sequences, let's just say. The very first one is issuing challenges if you are able to. So let's look at my 2 units here. Let's say that Arthur 3 back here is the leader of his warband. And then let's put D'Albret here. He's the French commander. Let's say he's the leader of that. If they're within 12 inches and Arthur here is the attacker, it's the start of his turn. Within 12 inches, he could issue a challenge right now. And that's the very first thing you look for. Is your leader within range, within 12 inches, to challenge the other leader to a duel? That's the very first thing. And then you either accept it or you reject it, and you go with the results if you take it, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. After the issued challenges, what you want to do first is you want to rally the battered unit. So that's the second thing you have to do, and I'll talk about that soon because there's a whole section for that. The third thing you have to do is look at wild charges. Now, wild charges are and we'll talk about it again soon, but it's the third thing that comes into play, and it's basically kind of a forced charge. Elite cavalry have it if they haven't used points to take it off. But once you're in range, they basically are elected and must charge first. That's the first thing that happens. So the first 3 things before you actually get into other orders, where you roll dice to do move, shoot, and attacks, you're going to be looking at first challenges. That's the first thing. The second thing you do is rally battered units, and then the third thing is look at wild charges, and finally the fourth thing is to do the rest of the movements and the shooting and the attacks and the like. So here's some very important things to consider about the ordering, because there are some rules here that may affect if you can activate in that order. The very first thing is the rally. So if you've gone through the challenge phase and now you're into rallying, if your unit tries to rally, that's the only thing it can do. Once it's rallied, if it doesn't matter if it's failed or if it's passed, a rally is its activation. It can't move or attack or do anything else. The rally is all it can do if it attempts to rally. So whether it fails or passes the rally, that's all that unit can do in that turn. The other thing is too, if you are successful on a wild charge, right? That's before the normal order activations. If you're successful on the wild charge, that is basically their activation. So if they're successful, they basically make an immediate attack, resolve it, and that's their activation. They can't activate again. However, if they fail a wild charge, they are allowed to make a move after, if you want, right? So they're allowed to make a move if a wild charge is failed. The final exception to the rule is the challenge, right after the challenge, I should say. If you make a challenge, like say these guys decide to challenge each other, let's say the attackers first, and he challenges this unit here and he accepts. That unit cannot take an order. That's its order. The challenge is the order. The only exception is if, say, it needs to rally. If that unit needs to rally, like maybe the leader dies or something happens to it, it may rally. That's the only thing it can do if it issues a challenge. So we'll look at that in more detail later on. Beyond that, there's also some reaction activations that can happen. Some units have rules where they can countercharge, so maybe 2 cavalry units are facing off and they can One decides to do an attack, and then the other one has countercharge. They can attack at the same time. We'll look at that later. And the other ones evade. Some units are able to try and evade out of the way, but those are reactions to activations. We'll get more into those later. So just a bit of little information. There's a little designer's note that he writes in here, and I think it's cool to mention that if you're playing the game, you should plan out the priority of what units you want to get stuck in, because sometimes you're going to fail your activations, and if you fail the activation, your turn is done. So it's ideal to prioritize who's going to be doing what first. You know, if you want your elite infantry to be the ones to get in ahead of everyone else, you should probably move them first, because you got some cheap yeomen or some skirmishers. You don't want them to go first and ruin your whole battle plan. So depending on what you want to do, you want to watch and see what your plan is first, and activate units accordingly. So let's talk about issuing challenges. Now, a lot of these games with leaders, they can challenge each other to a duel. And it's very straightforward how it works. Whoever's turn it is, okay, it could be the attacker's activation phase, it could be the defender's. If you first check, you have to see if the enemy is 12 inches away. The enemy leader, if it's 12 inches away from your enemy leader, guess what? You can issue a challenge. So let's play this out here. We have Arthur 3. He issues the challenges to Diabray here. Okay, sorry if I'm pronouncing the names wrong. And the French leader, he accepts. So what the rules state here is that if the rules are accepted, you're going to move to a space halfway between the units. So these are about 3 inches away from each other. A little more than 3. I'm going to put them halfway through, okay? They're going to meet there. Both the challenges accepted, okay? So that's what happens if it's accepted. Now, if he has accepted, he's accepted this rule here, okay? So he's going to fight. Now, this side here, since they've done the challenge, they can make no more activations. Also, if the guy's issuing the challenge, if that unit is battered, if the leader's unit is battered, he couldn't have issued a challenge. But he can still issue challenges to battered leader units. So just to say that again, you can issue a challenge if you are not battered, and you can still issue challenges to battered units. You just can't make the challenge yourself, okay? Okay, so it's accepted here. So what's going to happen when it's accepted? So when you accept the challenge, you're going to have a best out of 3 dice scenario. It's called fighting a duel, and I'm going to pull out an extra dice. I realize I only have 2 dice on there, but you're going to roll 3 dice per side here. So the challenge works something like this. The challenge is out. Let's use these black dice to represent the Brittany side of things, and then the fleur-de-lis blue and yellow dice to represent the French. So when a duel is broken out here, what you're going to do, there's no special stats or something for leaders. What happens is that they're basically doing a best out of 3 competition. Every roll of a 5 or a 6 counts as hitting the enemy. So let's see, since the challenge is Arthur here, let's roll some dice. Let's see if he rolls 5s and 6s. Okay, so he rolled a 5 and a 6 and a 1, okay? The French leader here, in response, rolls, and he rolled nothing here, okay? So, very simple here. He rolled a 5 and 6 compared to him here, Diabray here, who rolled nothing. He's won the duel because he's got more, and that means this leader here is dead. So he's been removed from the game. He lost the duel essentially, and that's very simple, you know. In Lion Rampant, it's very, very simple to lose your leader with a very simple, you know, if you have some bad luck, your leader just could be knocked out, just like that. One thing I just want to quickly add to the video that I forgot earlier was about issuing challenges. If your leader is in a challenge and your leader is battered, you're not rolling 3 dice in the challenge, you're rolling 2. I forgot to mention that. So if you have a battered leader, you might not want to consider accepting a challenge because you have a little bit of a disadvantage. You know, it's a 3 dice roll versus a 2. And that's all I wanted to add in. So what would happen in this scenario here is that he's the winner and he would return to the unit he was in. Okay, he won the duel. This unit here has to immediately perform a courage test, and we'll look at courage tests later. Okay, so they have to do a courage test. And that's it, and then you go from there. That's how the duels work. And he's lost his leader, he's lost the 12-inch bonuses that he puts on rerolls for other units that we were talking about. and then the battle goes on. They can't activate anymore because the challenge was essentially their activation, right? So they're out and the leader's dead there. Okay. The other thing that happens, let's say he comes back to life here. The other thing that could happen is, say Arthur issues a challenge here and the French say, I don't want to lose my leader, I reject the challenge. Okay, in that case what happens, then this unit here has to take a courage test as well, as if they lost their leader. So if you lose the duel and you lose your leader and that unit does have to take a courage test, or if you just reject the duel, they still have to take a courage test. I guess the benefit here is they don't lose their leader. And, you know, they're cowardly. You know, the Arthur could say, I'm a brave guy, and the French guy over there, he's a coward, right? So that's it for duels. There's no, like, special unit stats or armor they have separate. It's assumed that the leaders are kind of, like, on par here. There might be some special rules later on that we'd look at for leaders and upgrades. I'm not sure yet. I haven't looked at that section entirely. But we'll just end there, because that's simply all it is for issuing challenges. It's very, very, very simple. I should say this too, if you issue a challenge, it even overrides the wild charge rule. So yeah, challenges take precedent before everything, basically. So let's talk about battered units, because that's basically going to be the second part here. You know, you've looked at challenges and now you have to look at battered units. Let's just say the French here are battered, okay? We'll just say they're battered here, and it's now their turn. The only option they can really do here, they can't issue a challenge because they're battered. So they're going to have to test and see if they can no longer be battered, okay? What they're going to do is they're going to do a courage test. And I'm not going to do one now because we'll talk about courage tests later. But they're basically going to take 2 dice. There may be some negative modifiers in there that affect it. But they basically have to make a courage test to remove the battered status on top of them. And then, you know, if they're battered, they can't do things like they can't be ordered and they can't issue challenges and stuff like that, right? Okay, so that's the only option they have. If they're to pass the courage test when they're battered, they will remove the status that's battered, and then during their next turn, they'll be able to activate again. So if you rally, then that's it. That's your turn, you're done. You wait till your next turn to go on. And that might be okay, you know, if they're heavy infantry with good defense, it's okay to rally and, you know, be ready. They don't necessarily have to move. Now, if they fail it, they remove a single model. Say they fail this test, one of the guys in the unit runs off, you know, they're battered, they do a courage test and they fail. He's like, well, I'm not sticking around here. They lose a model. So if you're battered and you fail the courage test, you've lost a model. He flees, he runs, he books it, right? The next thing that happens is that they're going to retreat. They're going to run away. Like the actual unit is going to be moved itself. And we'll look at that a bit later as well. And I'm just going to mention this here. I think it's important to put it in here that if they do fail their courage test when they're battered, they retreat, which is moving half their movement value away from the enemy. So if they're 6 inches here, they'd be moving 3 inches away from the enemy there. So the other thing is too, if you're battered and your courage score, and we'll talk about this stuff later, it's a bit more complex, but if you get to 0 or a negative result on the courage, the actual courage test, the final score when they're battered, the whole unit routs. So, you know, if you're low on models and your guys are about to break, you don't want to be battered because that might be the end of your unit there. And the only other thing here too, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, in the game, if you fail a battered test, you know, if your unit doesn't pass the battered test here, it doesn't end your activation phase. So that was about battered units in the turn sequence. Let's look at the next part. So we did issue challenges, then you have to look at your battered units. After battered units, you're looking at wild charges, and this is usually going to becoming from units like the Fierce Foot, or in this case, the Elite Cavalry. They have the wild charge rule. So what you do with wild charge, it's the third thing you're looking at here, and you want to see if your enemy is within a contactable range of their movement, of their basic move. So Elite Cavalry, I think it was either 8 or 10, I don't remember, we'll look at the profile again later, but I do know that the 4 or 5 inches I have between here is contactable, and if these French guys here are going to be attacking these enemies across from them, that means that they are within the wild charge range here. Now, what you do with wild charge is you're going to look at their attack value. We looked at that before, and I believe their attack value was, I'm just going to look it up here quick, I believe it was 5, was it? Yes, it's 5. So they have wild charge and it's 5. So they're going to do an immediate test. They must do this if they're able to charge. Remember though, if they issue the challenge or if they're battered, they can't do the wild charge, okay? But they didn't. They didn't do either of that. They're okay. So we roll a dice here. I got a 7. So that means that these guys are going to be charging home. It's 5 and up. 5 and up for that. So they would be charging home. Now these guys could countercharge, and we'll look at the countercharge stuff later. That's a response. But if they wanted to countercharge, they could do that, and you know, that's just a reaction to the wild charge itself. Okay, but let's say that these cavalrymen actually don't do so hot. They roll snake eyes, 2 1s, let's just say. That means they failed their wild charge. That doesn't mean that their unit is out of their turn yet, right? So if you fail your, let's go back to battered for a second. If you fail your, if you fail rallying your unit in the, I keep saying a battered phase, but it should be the rally phase, really. If you fail to rally a battered unit, it doesn't end your turn. It just means that that unit might have to, it retreats and loses a model. And if you fail the wild charge test, you can no longer attack during that part of your turn, but you can still move. So if you want to like back off and come back later, you could do that. So you're still allowed to move even if you fail a wild charge. Okay, so this leads me to the last part of the order activations, part of the turn. So you've looked at issuing challenges, we've looked at rallying battered units, and we've looked at wild charges. Those 3 things happen first. The 4th thing is regular order activations. Now the rest of them here, moving, shooting, and attacking. And there's also skirmishing sometimes, but we'll look at that in more detail another time. Move, shoot, and attack can happen in whatever order you want. You should prioritize what you want to do with units first. And once you give them the order, you fully fulfill that order that you've given them. So if I want these cavalry, let's go back to the scenario where they fail their wild charge. They're still able to make a move, so I want to test for them on the move. Okay, well let's say they want to move. I'm going to test here. They need a 7 to move because their move is quite high. But you know what, the 3 is a fail, so they're not moving. The other thing I want to say here, since I'm on it and I failed here, failing this part in your turn, failing the actual order activation part, means that your turn ends. Okay, so it's a little brutal here. Okay, it's if you fail one of your unit's order activations, then your turn is done and it goes on to the next person's turn. That means any other unit that I have in my warband doesn't get to move because they failed their activation here. Okay, now I'm going to assume the leader's in here and just, I'm tying in other stuff here. Since there's a leader here, he's going to use his reroll, okay? He gets to do 1 reroll of attack, move, or shoot. So if we roll again, he rolled a 10. Now he can move, but he won't be able to give his reroll to anyone else. So actually, that was a really good example, that roll there that I just did, of how an elite cavalry unit could potentially if they failed a wild charge, and then they rolled I rolled a smaller number there. If they need a 7 and up again to actually move back. So if the wild charge here fails, and then you fail your movement order, they're actually now open to an attack from the cavalry. So there's a bit of luck there. But fortunately, my leader was in there, and he was able to negate that by using his one reroll. But that means that, the rest of his activation phase could continue, but if another unit now fails, that's it. Their activation phase is done. You go to the end of the turn, the end of the phase, and it's basically the end of the turn, just being switching to the next people playing, right? So yeah, that is basically the activation, or I should say, that's basically the turn sequence. You're going to be looking to issue challenges if you can, checking to see if your leader unit is battered or not. If he's battered, you can't issue a challenge. He can still issue a challenge to a battered unit. The next thing you do is you're going to rally battered units, and whether you pass or fail it, even failing it will continue on your turn. After you looked at all that and moved guys after rallying, you're going to look at who can wild charge if anyone can. If anyone can wild charge, work out those wild charges. Of course, if they've issued a challenge or they're battered, they can't do a wild charge. And finally, if they fail that wild charge, they may still be able to go into the final order activation part of the turn, which is moving, shooting, and attacking. And remember, in this last phase here, it doesn't matter which order you do those things in. You could shoot with one unit, move with the next one, then attack with the next one, then shoot again with the fourth if you can, right? It's just, all you have to do is carry out whatever order you do immediately, and then follow through all the tests and stuff. And we'll see that all more in motion when I start doing more solo and example games. So I'm just going to put some extra notes in here that I see from the author. There's alternative rules, of course. Some people don't actually really like that. Like, if that was the first unit there, and he failed his movement after failing the wild charge, and let's say he also fails his reroll, that means his whole turn is done. There's an alternative rule where basically they don't fail. You know, if they fail their activation, they just stay stationary and your turn doesn't end. I think it really depends on how you like to play. Like, if you want the game to go really fast, you probably want to apply this little house rule here. I personally will probably just use the real rules. I'm used to games like Hail Caesar where you fail the first unit and the whole division, the army doesn't move, so I don't really mind that. To me, that's like a chaotic part of the game that I enjoy. Sometimes soldiers get orders and they're like, hey, did we hear that right? Did he just say go backwards or sit here? What do we do? Sometimes these things get lost in communication. So I personally like it where if the unit has failed one of its activations, then the whole army, your whole warband basically sits there doing nothing. But if you don't like that and you want to try out the other rule here where he talks about, you know, just because they fail doesn't mean your turn's over, and you want a faster game, then maybe you can try that and apply that to the rules if you so desire. So yeah, that's all I want to say about today's stuff. That's basically the whole turn sequence here without getting too much into, you know, moving models around yet, or actually how movement, attacking, and shooting looks. But I think that's, I hope that's very straightforward for you guys, basically on how the turn sequence runs through. One thing I should add here is that, and I didn't say, is you don't have to move your units. The one things that you do have to do is, you know, you do have to, I guess you don't have to rally if you don't want to. I don't know why you wouldn't want to, but you basically look at the challenges, rally your battered units. Wild charges are a must thing if you have to. You know, if they have wild charge, you must do it. But you could opt to say, I'm not moving my whole army. You know, you could have moved up to a certain point and be like, okay, well, it's my turn now. I don't want to issue challenge. Okay, I won't. I'll rally my battered units, fine. And, oh, do I have any wild charges? Yes or no? Okay, but then maybe the rest of the army, you're like, you know, I'm a good strategic defensive position. I am not moving. You can just say, I end my turn, right? You don't have to activate them in the fourth part of the turn. So I'm just going to say that. There's no obligation to activate your units in the move, shoot, attack, or the skirmish part. You can just opt to say, this one's not moving, this one is shooting, but this one's not, you know? So you have a lot of choice here when you're doing the activation phase. So then, of course, as I said, after all that, the phase ends and your turn is done. So that's it for today. If there's any questions or something not clear, just please let me know. We're going to fill in some more gaps, like with moving, shooting, attacking, and like the counter charge and evading as they come along in the book. So stay tuned for that, and thank you all for watching. We will see you in the next one. Have a good one. Goodbye.